Well, good evening, everyone. It's a great pleasure to see all these friendly faces here. And of course, I'm delighted to be able to introduce to you Monsignor Tomas Halik. When they ask you to introduce visiting speakers, one rushes to read their books. One opens Wikipedia in desperate search to find out whatever they did that was so notable. But I have to tell you that in this case, I didn't really need to do any of this. Although we met in person only yesterday and then briefly, we discovered that we actually had very much in common. We graduated from the same college in Prague. We took very similar courses. We studied with the same professors. Hey, we even graduated, now that I think about it, from the same course for Army Reserve officers with specialization as infantry platoon leaders. In fact, his tormentor, one Lieutenant Colonel Petřík, was my tormentor. I remember him to this day. Monsignor Halik graduated from Charles University in Prague with a degree in philosophy and sociology in 1972. He then took a number of jobs that were available to those who were unwilling to sell their body and soul, especially the latter, to the old regime. At about this time, that is in the 70s, Tomáš, having studied with philosophers like Patočka, Machovec, and several others, and I'm sure having read Chesterton, having read Graham Greene and those types of thinkers, became involved in the clandestine church. And he did so seriously. In fact, so seriously that he was in great secrecy then ordained as priest in, I think, in East Germany, right? In Erfurt, what was then East Germany, in 1978. After the fall of the old regime, the need for this sub rosa behavior disappeared, and so Tomáš soon was able to become one of the most authentic public intellectuals who could address with considerable moral authority problems in the fields of theology, philosophy, and more, politics. He became a prolific author and even sort of moral political activist. Awards and prizes and great honors followed. I have a very short list. It really is reduced from the real one. In 2003, he won the Cardinal König Award. 2009, he was awarded he was chosen by Pope Benedict XVI as Monsignor. The next year, 2010, he won the Romano Guardini Prize for Outstanding Merits in Interpreting Contemporary Society. In 2010, his book Patience with God won the Best Theological Book Prize in Europe. I think it was also a Book of the Month among Catholic books in the United States. 2012, he won the Knight's Cross from the government of Poland. And of course, most notably, in 2014, he won the Templeton Prize. And last year, as if this wasn't enough, he won the Doctor Honoris Causa degree from Oxford University. I am sure I have skipped many important honors and awards, and it's very generous of you to say that it doesn't matter. But I, in fact, did so in order to gain a little bit of time to tell you what you will never learn on the internet. And that is that because of a typical Czech army mess, Officer candidate Halik, as he was doing his one-year obligatory military service, became, although for one day only, the highest officer on duty in the city of Prague. So among all these generals and colonels and majors and so on, here was officer candidate Halik, a secret Catholic, who was in charge of all these tools of power. And in fact, he revealed to me a great state secret only last night after several bottles of wine and some drugs. He revealed that there were 3 buttons that he commanded, of which one, I've forgotten the first 2, but the last one was red. And whoever touched it set into motion general mobilization. But I think I would truly be amiss to speak about his military escapades and many prizes and international awards without mentioning the most important thing about Tomas Halik. He is a decent human being. It is hard to imagine now how much conviction, how much faith, how much moral courage it took under the old regime to get involved in the underground church, and how much courage and conviction it now takes to defend the refugees, especially the Muslim refugees, from the wars we have started in the Middle East. That he is now routinely denounced and scorned by the European neo-fascists who have gained control over a very large segment of the public space is to his great credit. I should also mention, in conclusion, that this event is made possible by a generous grant from the European Commission delegation in Washington, D.C., and it's part of a program that's called EU Futures. Monsignor Halik.
Thank you for inviting me. Thank you for coming. Thank you, Igor, for this nice obituary. Ladies and gentlemen, a specter is haunting Europe, the specter of communism. Marx and Engels wrote in 1848. The specter of communism ended its bloody passage through European history after more than 150 years with a series of non-violent revolutions in 1989, non-violent except in the case of Romania. There followed a wave of enthusiasm and determination to build a new democratic, free and just society. During the communist period, we used to joke that the Soviet leader Leonid Brezhnev merited Nobel Prize for surgery for having successfully transplanted the heart of Europe into the digestive tract of the Soviet Union. That intervention was now supposed to be remedied. Back to Europe was one of the most appealing slogans of the post-communist countries. It was expected that a powerful, united Europe, a union of advanced democratic states, would emerge after the fall of the Iron Curtain as a reliable partner of the United States. The victorious model of Western democracy would inspire political and economic developments in other parts of the world. That expectation was not fulfilled. Nowadays, the world is a very dangerous place, more so than at any time since the end of World War II. A new specter is haunting Europe. The specter of populism, nationalism, terrorism, and political extremism. But are these monsters really something new? To many observers, the situation is reminiscent of the 1930s, when the movements of fascism, Nazism, and Bolshevism were gaining strength, and the most terrible of the wars was on the horizon. The situation in the 1930s was a result of the Great Depression. A few years ago, our world underwent a major financial crisis, but it did not result in global social and economic catastrophe. It did have one consequence, however, which represents one of the causes of the current situation, a crisis of confidence. More and more people believe that the present system of political and economic democracy will be incapable of fulfilling their expectations. Many aspects of this crisis remain unclear. What are the people's conscious and unconscious expectations? What are their needs and notions of happiness? What are the things that have become a subject of distrust and concern? To what degree are people's fears realistic and directed at the real causes of the difficulties? Worry, anxiety, and fear give rise to aggressive emotions. Populist politicians make use of these emotions of fear and hatred and present people with enemy images, targets for their aggression. Nowadays, a favorite target for attacks are migrants, the establishment, the European Union, and elites. Trust in European Union institutions and confidence in the future of a united Europe have indeed been waning recent years. At the same time, however, the confidence of citizens in their own countries, their own states, and traditional political institutions, especially established political parties, has also declined. It is a loss of confidence not only in political elites, but also in the traditional elites of influence, moral and cultural institutions, such as the public media, the universities, and the churches. Moral and cultural institutions ought to operate as a kind of immune system in society. In every society, there are groups of frustrated people who tend towards political extremism. In the same way that every human body contains a certain amount of pathological cells. If the immune system functions properly in the body, these cells are not dangerous. But if the immune system fails, the pathological cells start to proliferate. It would seem that the immune system in our societies is failing for one reason or another. Populist politicians constantly attack the independent media and intellectuals, particularly public intellectuals who take a stand against prejudice and stereotypes in public opinion. When television was the chief medium of mass communication, and there were just a few television channels, television took over some of the social roles of religion. It influenced people's lifestyles and thinking, presenting grand narratives and common symbols. It was the arbiter of truth, credibility, and importance of information. I have seen it on my own eyes in the television, so it is true. It was the second item in the news, so it is important. It was always the role of religion to influence the way of thinking, way of life, to offer some symbols, narratives, and so on. Television played this role. Today, social media and the internet are the chief means of mass communication. Changes in the field of communications media always had major political and cultural consequences. The invention of printing once helped spread the ideas of Reformation. Radio contributes the great influence of political leaders such as Hitler and Goebbels, as well as Roosevelt and Churchill. Television coverage of the presidential debate enabled the victory of John F. Kennedy. The current expansion of internet social networks is causing further political changes, and in many countries this breaks down the space for public debate, which is the sine qua non of classical democracy. Individual groups of people become enclosed in their bubbles and only consume the information that boosts their convictions and emotions, virtually isolated from any alternative or corrective vision of the world. But because of competition and financial problems, even the classic media are pressured into dealing mostly with local issues, and preferably in the form of sound bites and entertainment. A very specific phenomenon is the media treatment of terrorism and violence. The media have unwittingly become the principal allies and tools of the terrorist. A classical example of this was the 9/11 atrocity. The terrorist's prime concern is not the killing of people, but making sure that their act receives attention far and wide through the mass media. The attack of the Twin Towers should have an incomparable small effect, and most likely would never have happened if television channels did not broadcast it into almost every home on the planet. Without media attention, terrorism would be almost toothless. Also, public service media cannot afford to ignore terrorist acts. However, people have a limited capacity to perceive and emotionally process the information and images that they consume. The harrowing photographs of the Vietnam War aroused opposition to the war in America and in the world, and did much more to contribute to America's defeat than the weapons of the communist guerrillas. Nowadays, however, the deluge of media reporting from places of violence tends to desensitize people's consciousness because they are saturated with these images. Violence is perceived as a constant component of the world into which people are thrust, a world with which they disgust overall, and in which they feel lost and helpless. I mentioned that churches and religious institutions are also among the moral and cultural institutions that should play the role of society's immune system. In recent decades, the mainstream Christian churches, probably as a reaction to the sexual revolution of the 60s, focused too much on sexual morals, anti-abortion campaign, LGBT relations, contraceptions, etc. The natural reaction of the secular public was, look at what is happening in your own ranks. Scandals connected with sexual abuse have contributed to the long-term decline of the influence of the Christian churches in secular societies. But the secular world underestimated the strength and vitality of religion. In his famous speech in Frankfurt, autumn 2001, the philosopher Jinger Habermas surprised many people when he declared, we live in a post-secular world. On the threshold of the third millennium, we are witnesses to a major transformation of religion that has noticeable political consequences. For a long time, the Western public was of the view that the ideal model of relations between religion and politics was separation of church and state, and that this model could be applied even beyond the frontiers of the civilization historically formed by Christianity. However, the church, as an institution representing religion while being distinguishable from nation and state, has no parallel outside Christianity. Moreover, in the Western world, the churches have lost their monopoly of religion, and states have lost their monopoly of politics. What is meant by the postmodern society being post-secular? Unlike those who talk about the return of religion, God is back, I prefer to speak about the global transformation of religion. It is not a matter of returning to good old-time religion. The fundamentalism of the representatives of the religious right is also a modern phenomenon that only plays a traditional religion. The transformation of religion has surprised and shocked both the proponents of secularization theories and the representative of traditional religious institutions. The most striking phenomenon that represents a challenge to rethink the relationship between religion and politics is political radicalism in the Islamic world and that misused religious rhetorics and symbolism. However, what we are witnessing in the Arab world is not the politicization of religion, but rather the sacralization of politics. Where emotions are too powerful, secular language is not strong enough to express them. So people, including secular politicians, sometimes spontaneously reach for religious language. But it is a vocabulary that contains symbols which derive power and energy from the depths of the unconsciousness. When a political rival is labeled Great Satan, a rational solution to conflict is no longer possible. The misuse of religious language in politics can transform political conflicts into an apocalyptic war between good and evil, first in people's minds and then in reality. But in such a war, the danger is that evil will be victorious. It is from the Christian churches that we should request a momentous service, the desacralization of politics. The Bible helps desacralize both nature and political power. For the ancient world, nature was divine power, full of gods and demons. According to the Bible, the world was entrusted to human beings to rule and care for it. For the Oriental despots, rulers were gods or sons of gods. But in the Bible, the prophets remind rulers that they are simply people, criticizing them and removing their divine aura. In the course of its history, Christianity tries to sacralize politics on many occasions with tragic results, misusing religious symbols in service of political power. In the period leading up to the World War II, some right-wing circles in Europe also misused Christian rhetorics and particular nostalgia for medieval Christian Europe in order to attack liberal democracy and support nationalism and authoritarian regimes. We are now witnessing similar efforts in the part of the present nationalistic regime in Poland and several right-wing movements in Hungary and Slovakia, whose leaders frequently make use of fear of Islam and migrants. This is all the more reason to value and support other forms of Christianity represented in today's world by Pope Francis in particular. He is of the view that the church's role should be above all a prophetic voice to arouse the conscience of the world, appealing for peace and reconciliation, for the poor, for the social justice, as well for responsibility for the natural and social environment. For several decades now, the Catholic Church has played a significant role in the non-violent transition of authoritarian regimes, both right-wing and left-wing, to democracy in Chile, Argentina, the Philippines, Poland, and a number of other countries. But the churches and other faith-based organizations, along with moral and cultural institutions, have an important role after the fall of dictatorships. When asked once what would follow communism, Alexander Solzhenitsyn replied, a very, very long period of healing. Dolga, dolgaya, doroga uzdravlения. Post-communist societies have neglected to provide therapy for the wounds inflicted on individuals and society by communism. In those societies, there live many people who were damaged by the totalitarian regime. Some of them have a yearning for revenge. Others have lost the courage to trust people, and they no longer have the energy to start a new life in the new conditions. They are opponents of the old regime who are not capable of living without an enemy and go on looking for new enemies. But of course, they are also people they were guilty of collaborating with the dictatorship in various ways. Let us record the excellent book about the various degrees of guilt written after the fall of German Nazism by the philosopher Karl Jaspers. It is neither possible nor right to bring all the guilty to justice, to the court. The power of undemocratic regimes was not represented solely by the narrow group of leaders with immediate responsibility for political decisions or by the army or secret police. There was also the complicity of silent assent, of anonymous and formal support for the regime, the complicity of passivity that people find it hard to admit to, even in retrospect. At the extremes, there are two unacceptable ways of coming to terms with the past. One is the witch hunt, the spirit of vengeance and even violence. The other is the trivialization and displacement of guilt. Between those two extremes, it is necessary to seek and to implement a strenuous process of reconciliation and genuine healing, which is clearly a spiritual and moral process. Who better will be expert at forgiveness than Christians and the churches which have 2,000 years of practice of accompany the guilty? I recall many conversations with the former American ambassador to the Czech Republic, John Shatak, who had considerable experience of how churches, together with members of caring professions such as psychologists and social workers, contribute towards healing and reconciliation in South Africa after the end of apartheid. I myself subsequently had the opportunity in South Africa to speak with people who had been part of that process. I had to agree with John Shatak that in our country and several other post-communist societies, the churches had not managed to assume in time that role of healing the scars of the past. This task will soon be a topical issue in Cuba and other countries. According to the Russian writer Alexander Zinoviev, the Soviet system developed a specific human type, Homo Sovieticus, the Soviet man. The large support for Putin in Russia today is evidence that that type of humanity, brainwashed by state propaganda, still prevails there. So long as Homo Sovieticus predominates in some of the post-Soviet republics, it is hard to conceive of building properly functioning political and economic democracy there. The mental transformation of society does not happen automatically with the transformation of the economic system. The missionaries of market fundamentalism, like the former Czech President Václav Klaus, borrow it from Marxism and naive economic determinism, and their ideology was in reality Marxism in reverse. The transformation of mentality is a long and complex process. I heard a story about Native Americans who were being transported from their old settlements to new ones. Halfway there, they requested a break. Our bodies are almost in the new settlements, but our souls are still in the old ones. We have to wait for our souls. When revolutions occur, citizens aren't usually allowed a break, however. So they have to learn as they go, sometimes through trial and error. But critical reflection on such experiences is needed to make sure tragic errors are kept to the minimum. Democracy is not simply a political system. It is a culture of human relations. On the occasion of the first anniversary of the first Czechoslovak Republic, Tomáš Masaryk, the father of modern Czech democracy, declared, now we have democracy, what also need are democrats. After the fall of communism, the establishment of democratic institutions, the parliament and political parties, the Senate, the Constitutional Court, local administrative authorities, freedom of the media, etc., was not the most difficult task. But institutions are like bodily organs. If they are to live and function properly, they need blood to circulate. That role is performed by civil society. Václav Havel strove to support the development of civil society in the Czech Republic in every possible way. His successor, Václav Klaus, regarded civil society as the main enemy of his policies, which were based on trust in the automatic operation of the invisible hand of the market. But it soon became apparent that unless the new governing elite is overseen by civil society, and unless the reveal of the market economy is accompanied by renewal of a culture of law, the invisible hand of the market soon turns into invisible hand of corruption. Also the free media, which ought to be democracy's watchdogs, did report regularly on corruption scandals. There were so many reports that overlapped that as a result they failed to sound a warning and instead created the impression that corruption and illegal activity were commonplace and therefore something normal. I believe that the most important knowledge to be derived from the study of post-communist society is the discovery that the creation and maintenance of political and economic democracy system requires constant nurture of society's cultural and moral biosphere. Both in countries of the Central and Eastern Europe, under the communist regimes, and in the Arab countries under dictatorial regimes, the chief aim of democratic opposition was to achieve free elections, the main symbol and tool of democracy. But after the fall of the dictators in the Arab countries, the elections were won by extremists. And now in the post-communist countries, populist and nationalistic parties are becoming stronger in free elections. Successful political leaders like Orban in Hungary, Zeman in the Czech Republic, and Kaczynski in Poland not only criticize the model of liberal democracy, but seek step by step to undermine liberal democracy and particularly the freedom of the media. Politicians like Orban and Zeman make no secret of their affinity with Putin, and in the recent period, Donald Trump has become their hero. Since Trump's election victory, the Russian offensive has been noticeably stepped up. It would seem that Western Europe, and also people around Donald Trump, is not adequately aware of the great danger of Russian nationalism and nostalgia for the Soviet Empire. Putin's Russia is waging an intense propaganda war, especially with the help of widespread disinformation of internet, social networks, targeting pro-European and pro-Western ideas in Central and Eastern Europe. It is using all possible means to promote the breakup of the European Union and also support the extreme nationalists in the West. I was asking in Brussels what the European Union is doing to defend itself against this propaganda war. And I think there is nothing like that. For a while, we thought that the crisis of confidence in democracy in Central and Eastern Europe was due to the omission of an important element when building democracy after the fall of communism. That is certainly true, but democracy fatigue and distress of democracy in its present form are also spreading in the countries with lengthy, unbroken traditions of democracy on both sides of the Atlantic. The current growth of populism, nationalism, and political extremism are not specific to the post-communist countries. Brexit and the recent presidential elections in the United States have shown that even the Anglo-Saxon world is far from immune to populism and demagogy. The crisis of liberal democracy is due not only to the crisis of confidence in the democratic system and the contemporary type of capitalist economy as well, as in the credibility of ideas of liberal democracy, but also to more profound crisis of confidence in general. In a society oriented much toward the individual than toward social cohesiveness, the individual eventually feels lost and isolated, particularly due to weakening of the family. Many people fail to create their own identity, personal identity, and as a result easily become attached to the groups that offer a strong sense of group identity, collective identity. They are the political sects, the extremists, and so on. They are offering the collective identity to the people. They have no strong personal identity. People who are exposed to advertising brainwashing that promises them happiness and fulfillment through performance, earning and consumpting of goods, ends up thrust into the vicious circle over exertion, exhaustion and frustration. Technology, which was the source of pride of modern men, now tends to be regarded as a threat. Millions of people will soon lose their jobs due to the digital revolution. For a long time, the West tended to define its identity negatively in the confrontation with communism. After the fall of communism and the admission of the post-communist countries into the Western structures of the European Union and NATO, the West seemed to lose any clear identity and common language. I do not regard the fall of communism as the West victory in the Cold War, but rather as a side effect of the globalization process. The socialist regimes based on state-plate economies and censorship of culture could not compete in a free fire's wind of competition in the global market of goods and ideas. Open societies benefit from the process of globalization, but it is not easy, but it is no easy task to create an open society from a closed one. It is always easier to make fish into fish soup than to make fish out of the fish soup. In many countries, further progress in the globalization process is encountering resistance and fears of loss of local identity. The main reason for the revival of nationalism in Europe and extremism in the Islamic world is precisely this fear of loss of identity. Now there are calls throughout Europe for maintenance of European identity, of the Christian identity of Europe in the face of migration from the Arab world. The question should be asked whether Europe didn't lose that identity long time ago. The Islamic ideology offers a common language to many dissatisfied people in the former third world, but also to the fourth world of frustrated and disposited people at the heart of the West, as well as in some countries of the former Soviet bloc. The expansion of the West took place mostly on an administrative and economic basis, and it underestimated the cultural and spiritual dimension of the integration process. The architects of European unification defined the ideal of European unity chiefly as a community of values. However, during the integration process after 1989, there was scarcely any public debate about those values, and above all, no systematic nurturing and cultivation of those values. Radical Islam offers a kind of common language awareness of shared values that the West currently lacks. The secularism of the liberal left and the religious fundamentalism of the conservative right are clearly two false alternatives. It is my belief that liberal democracy in the post-secular age needs to develop a spiritual and moral dimension, and in order to do needs a competent partner in the world of religion. Pope John Paul II and Pope Benedict both spoke of the danger of religion that lacks critical reason. But rationality without spiritual and moral inspiration is equally one-sided and can also be dangerous. It is my view, however, that only now, with the reforming pontificate of Pope Francis, 600 years after the German Reformation, a form of ecumenical Christianity is coming into being that could be the necessary partner of secular humanism and critical rationalism in seeking hope in this dangerous epoch. I believe that the West can find a language to counter the slogans of populism, nationalism, and fundamentalism, a language that is needed in the process of globalization, is to become a culture of communication. So it's end of my manuscript. I read this manuscript to Igor, and he said to me, I should say something more about hope. So yes, I am a man of hope. I'm not an optimist. In our country, people say the optimist is a human person who has lack of information. Optimism is sometimes the illusion that the things are going better and better automatically. And the hope is the strength to withstand the situation when the things are going worse and worse. I think now the things are dangerous, but we need hope. And I think we cannot expect a hope from outside. We should seek the spark of hope in our hearts, in our brains, in our communities. Speaking for my community, it's the university and the church. In the university, we need to discuss about it. and we need to understand what has happened in these societies, what is the background, the psychological background of this populism, which is so victorious. And we were shocked. I was last year in Oxford, just one day before the Brexit. All the professors are absolutely sure that the Britain will remain. I asked the taxi driver and the maid, and they both said, we are against. We are for Brexit. So perhaps there is a great division in the global societies. The people with education can profit from globalization, like the open societies can profit from globalization. But the other part of the world and the other part of the society is feeling lost and frustrated and isolated. And perhaps those frustrated people now receive their media in the social media. It is the space for these frustrated people. They think we have now the possibility to apply our voice, our views. And I receive so many terrible emails for those people, and there is so much anger and aggressivity. And I think there is a great division in the societies, and perhaps we need the people. They will build the bridges. I think that it's about the university, about the Catholic Church. I think the Church should play an important role to build a bridge between the Islamic world and the Western liberal society, because the Church has much in common with both. We have much in common, especially with the Shia Islam, and we have much in common with the liberal society, because the liberal democracy was born from the womb of the traditional Christianity and has much in common, common values. So I think the Church should play the role to communicate with both and to try to build the bridges. And also the model of Church as a field hospital. It is the idea of the Pope Francis. The Church is a field hospital, not as a castle which is defending against all enemies, but a field hospital. And I'm thinking about this, and that the liberal society needs some spiritual impulse. I was asked during my lecture in Germany if Christianity should be a hope for the contemporary Europe, and I say yes, of course. It's a very suggestive title, and it is expected that the Catholic priest will say, of course. But I think I can't say yes to the general question: which sort of Christianity should be hope for Europe today? Not the Christianity of yesterday, not the Christianity of the past. Christianity is always changing, is very flexible, goes through many transformations. And I think that this Christianity, which I feel in this testimony of the Pope Francis, the open-minded, open Christianity, ecumenical Christianity, could be really this competent partner for the liberal society, because we need both. We need the liberal democracy, but we need also this spiritual impulse for this, a moral vision. And so perhaps it is the task for the future. So, thank you. Thank you.
I love the idea of a field hospital, by the way. I think it's great. All right.
All right. Thank you very much. I want to be a little provocative.
Yes, yes, please.
So as you raise the several factors,
Yeah.
and one thing that would bring those factors together. Yeah, that's fine. I don't think that's working that way. One says on.
I will take my
Mode,
paper for notice.
digital era.
Okay, yeah. Yeah, yeah.
We can hear you.
Yeah,
All right, I'll project.
I just,
The fact is that, for instance, after the fall of communism, there was a rush towards a Western model of what you said at one point, if I understood, was political and economic democracy.
yeah.
My provocation was it wasn't economic democracy. It was neoliberalism.
Yes.
And in the economic sphere, that's creating these parts of society that you then pointed us towards, which feel left out and dissatisfied and marginalized, and therefore vote for illusionary heroes like Orban or Zeman or Trump. And so the role for morality, be that in the Catholic Church led by Pope Francis, who is, in my mind, very impressive in his commitment about this, but even outside of formal churches, because another main evolution we see in our society is a movement of younger people, or even older folks, towards a spirituality which doesn't have a specific organized religion behind it. So there's this moral impulse that needs to be brought to bear into the economy, into the business world. What we have failed in all of our societies in the West is that we have given businesses an excuse not to be moral, especially in the Anglo-Saxon economy,
Yeah,
United
yeah,
States and United Kingdom, where we say that as long businessmen are taught in business schools, whether it be here at BU or at Harvard across the river, as long as I'm not breaking any law, it's okay. And the church has to say, no, that's not okay. You're destroying the planet, you're destroying your societies, you're destroying yourselves. Okay.
Yeah. So the idea of the economic democracy was free market, but there's the idea inspired by the social teaching of the church and also some the German political philosophy, the social free market and or social ecological free market, and I think it is what we need. Yes, I agree. But there was a problem because I spoke about it. The people like Václav Klaus, and they were so inspired by Madame Thatcher, but it was a little bit vulgarization of Thatcher's ideology. They expected that, like the Marxists expected the new socialist men after the socialization of the economy, after privatization of economy, there will be a new capitalist men who have the initiative and all this, but it is not so simple.
And they ignored Czech values of Masaryk, Havel, who understood you have to humanize, including the economy. You can't do it the other way.
Absolutely, yeah, I agree.
We have another question right here.
Hi, my name is Julia Arnus. My question is, how can the church hope to serve the really important roles you're talking about, such as bridge building, healing, and reconciliation, without bringing women in the sort of central, equal role that they have not been to date? How can the church sort of do all that you're hoping that it will do? And sort of relatedly, you mentioned oversight on the part of civil society towards elites. Is there enough oversight that people have towards the church? And if not, how could the church be flexible in that regard?
Of course we need the charisma of women. Yes, I agree.
To the extent that a woman could be pope.
So, yeah. We will see.
Reverend Professor Monsignor Halik, When you said to everyone here in the room that we needed to renew communication, that we needed to renew in particular a sense of civil values and civil discourse, I'm wondering if what you're thinking is that we need a type of new recognition of respect for the other, whether it's our next door neighbor or the very distant other, like Shiite Muslims now in the West. If we're going to have this renewed respect for the other, how best could we go about it? Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. We need this respect for the diversity, for the others, for our neighbors. And so this very pluralistic society, and now Europe also is becoming pluralistic religiously, culturally, and we need this education for this culture to accepting and to understand and to live not only side by side, but together. And there is a great fear of this diversity. And also what I was speaking about, these people are living in these bubbles, and yes, it's very dangerous. So we need this culture of communication. It was my last sentence. We should transform the process of globalization in the culture of communication. But we need many instruments for this, beginning the family, and then the school, and then all the NGOs and the churches, and so on every level there should be some education for this. Not only tolerance. Tolerance is not enough. To live together, the enrichment. Engagement.
I'd like to give a hopeful example.
Yeah.
The Somerville schools that my grandchildren go to, that have so many people from all over the world, so many refugees. Mm-hmm. And there's a marvelous principal, and all the teachers are very much truly working to bring all the cultures together. And once a year there's a dinner, and then everybody performs their songs and their dances and so on. And these children truly are living as one nation, and they come from all over the world, and yet they respect where they came from. And I think that's where it begins. And it's already right here in Somerville.
Absolutely. I have similar experience, which was a formative experience for my life. During the Prague spring, it was a short period when we were allowed to travel to the West. And I was in Austria. There was a seminar organized by the British Quakers for young people, and there were people from from practically all continents, many cultures, many religions, and we spent 3 weeks together discussing all the great issues, the poverty and social justice. And so. We didn't solve all the problem of the world, but I learned there to see the problems from the perspective of the others. And it was for me a formative experience. Then I was not allowed to travel another 20 years. But for all this time, I think I must devote my life to build the bridges between the different people. I remember the first evening, I got a common room with one black African from, I don't know, Uganda, and there was a cross on the wall, and he said, "Oh, I'm so sorry about this man." And I think, oh, he sees our symbol quite in different way. I have many emotions looking at the cross, but I never had the idea, I'm so sorry about this man. And oh, he sees it from his perspective. So I learned to understand. There were some very left-wing Spanish worker priest, and influenced by the Marxist influence of the theology of liberation. You are against all Marxism. And then I realized, oh, if I would live there, I would perhaps see the things differently. And so we must always to take in account somebody speaking to us, from which perspective he's speaking, from which experience, from which culture, and then we can understand it. And there is the space for dialogue and sharing.
Professor Rosenberg.
Monsignor Halik, thank you so much for that talk. I enjoyed it very much, and I particularly appreciate the spirit of the mixture of a sort of a Catholicism and a Czech Havelian spirit of civic consciousness. I really adore and have been thinking about a lot in this past year of these populist elections. I've been thinking about Havel a lot in particular, and his fear of ideology and fear of the dominance of ideology. I do want to say I'm a little worried about one of the images that you used, and I want to tease it out a little bit, because I think we need to be careful to cultivate that spirit of communication that you were talking about. And that's the image of the media and civil society and universities as being somehow an immune system of society. Mm-hmm. I'm a little worried about that, because as you say, we need to be communicating with Trump voters, with Brexiteers, with the taxi driver who supported this, Britain leaving the European Union. And I worry that we can't communicate with them if we think of their ideas or their ideologies as something that needs to be attacked, like some sort of disease. And similarly, maybe I'm naively optimistic, but I'm similarly not as concerned about the internet necessarily creating bubbles, because that too might be a means of communication. I like what you said about this sort of illiberal culture left over from communism. And I think of us not so much as an immune system, but maybe as some kind of solvent of these big, blustery populist ideas that can be broken down, and individuals can have their humanity restored as these big ideologies are broken down into individual experiences through individual conversations. And I'm just wondering if you have any hope for communicating with the populists in a way that might restore their sense that their dignity is respected.
You are certainly right. So I didn't meant by this pathologic cell all the people with the different political views. I meant just in some society there are people which are really crazy, which are really so frustrated, and they are so aggressive, and they are waiting always for a sort of ideology which could give them the arguments and self-justification and so on. So I don't think that all people, they are voting for Trump and Zeman, and so are pathological people. But there are some extremists from both, from left and right, and they are really dangerous. So yes, and in this way, I think there should be some atmosphere of sharing values which is creating a little bit the norm, or the atmosphere in which the people are able to say, so it is enough. But on the other hand, of course, we need the discussion and to understand the people with different views. But now the situation also especially in our country, and I think it's not only in our country, the society is so divided, and it's so difficult to speak with the others, because they are so on both sides there are this image of enemies, and so the prejudices, and the atmosphere is so emotional Now is the time for this emotions, and it is so difficult to bring some rational arguments. The people are speaking about a post-truth society, or post-factical society. The emotions are much more successful, and especially these emotions of aggression than some rational discourse. And it is dangerous, and so we need the field hospital also for this. But I think we must first learn some sort of healing instruments.
Can I
Yes, of
jump
course.
in here and say, I actually understood your parable involving the pathological cells as not referring to other people, but rather referring to the capacity for evil in us.
Of course.
Right? So it wasn't really a reference to the cab driver or to the steel worker who has been unemployed for years, and therefore he chooses a different candidate from those of us who actually are not on the losing side of history. But all of us are vulnerable to the seductive voices of authoritarian seductions, and that's what may trigger the pathological growths in every single one of us.
Absolutely. I was trained in the Jung depth psychology, so I think there's very important notion that everyone has his dark side, his shadow, and sometimes we are projecting our shadows on the others, especially when we feel some aggression and allergy to someone who have done nothing to us, but we have this irrational aggressive. We should always ask if that person is not a mirror for us, and he is showing us our own dark side, our own shadows, our own treatise which we are not able or not willing to accept that it is our problem, and then we project it for the others, and then they are the target how to struggle with this. But we should struggle first in these problems in ourselves, and it is part of the spiritual path. It is something very important for the spiritual life to struggle with our own demons, and not to projecting them for the others and then to kill it.
Yes, I can speak loud enough unless you really want to speak into this.
It's better.
A lot of what you just said actually covered what I was going to ask, so I can maybe just simply ask then, the mirror that populism and anti-immigrant sentiments and the sorts of hatred that are oftentimes discussed in academic societies, social circles regarding conservative people of America, Britain, Germany, any other nation who are furious with the people who have run their lives for the last decade to half century, however you would like to look at it. And I'm curious, when they hold that mirror to you, what do you see? What should the intellectual elites of the world really be seeing in this mirror? Or at least what do you see when looking into that mirror?
Good question. And difficult question. Difficult question. I'm afraid I'm not able to to answer it so shortly. It's impulse for rethinking.
It seems like thank you, Monsignor, for your talk. But it seems like in individualized culture, there's a danger into being or what they've called the nun generation, spiritual but not religious. And you said the need of the prophetic role for an institution to stand up against populism, to offer a different narrative of being prophetic. So I'm wondering, my question is spirituality enough? Or does there need to be some form of institution to stand up? Because it strikes me that the church is prophetic in that in difference we live in unity, or at least strive to, or unity, not uniformity.
I think the church should take care of the people they are outside the church, and it is the task. I'm just doing research in the Eastern Central Europe about this, how to communicate with those seekers. Many people, like the sociologist Watnow and Charles Taylor, are speaking that the main difference today is not between believers and non-believers, but between the seekers and dwellers. And the number of dwellers is decreasing in the churches and also among the atheists. There are many believers. They are not dwellers, owner of the truth. They understand their faith as a way, as a path to the depths. And also among many non-believers, they are people, they are also seekers. They are not a dogmatic atheist. And I think there should be an alliance of these seekers. And I'm thinking that in the future, for the church will be very important to develop the third path of pastoral work. Now, the majority of priests and active people in the church are trained for the classical pastoral work in the parishes and so on, or for the classical missionary, just to put the people into the existing structures, institutional structures or intellectual structures. And I think the church should develop the third way, and it is accompany the seekers in dialogue, in respect, not to push them into the existing structures, but in reverse, a little bit to enrich and to open the existing structures and to enrich it with this experience of these seekers. So I think I have next week some meeting in Prague with the chaplains in the army, chaplains in the hospital, chaplains in the prison and the university. And they are the people, they are there for all. The chaplain in the prison is not only for the pious criminals. He is for all them. And it is the idea that everybody has the spiritual dimension of his personality, and especially in the extreme situation, like in the army, in the hospital, and so on, the spiritual dimension is vigilant. The people are asking some important questions concerning the sense of the life. It is the spiritual dimension, the questions, the seeking, the sense of my life. And I think these priests and the people of the church should be the partners, not just to push them into existence, but to go with them in respect, in dialogue, and this accompany the seekers. I think it is the way for the future.
I want to comment to this and also to this last question, because I had spoke recently about being a psychotherapist in Prague in the 90s. And as you're speaking, I'm remembering how fast everything was, that the companies were coming and people were trying to figure out how to live the new reality after communism. And there was a lot of disarray, but a lot of rush. And so it always struck me that there was a lost opportunity at that period because Havel had been opening the moral questions, but they got closed down very fast, partly because of events. But in working with clients in this healing modality, which is secular, if you held a spiritual perspective, then the client would always bring their seeking. They would always bring, if they were religious, they brought their religious language. So if the space was open enough, then people brought whatever version they had of a moral life or of a religious life or of a spiritual life. So that makes me come down more on the spiritual framework, I suppose, for the kind of process that you're speaking about.
What's the question?
It
It was just yeah. I have the similar experience because I was 7 years psychotherapist with drug abusers and alcoholics. During this time, I was secretly ordained priest in the private chapel of the bishop in Erfurt. Even my mother didn't know that I was a priest, and I lived with her. So it was 11 years, so very dramatic underground church activity. But I understood also this, my civil profession, and especially my profession as a psychotherapist, as a part of my spiritual mission. And I discovered that the priest activity is not just to celebrate the Mass, and it is to take responsibility for the spiritual climate of the society. And with the spiritual growth of the personality, and to help the people also to touch the wounds. I wrote a book with the title "Touch the Wounds" because I'm so fascinated with this legend about Saint Martin. The Saint Martin, the devil, the Satan, appeared in the figure of Christ. But Saint Martin asked him, "Where are your wounds?" And I say, I don't believe in God without wounds. I don't believe in a faith without wounds. I don't believe in a church without wounds. The wounds we should, and when I was in Madras, in India, and after the legend, place of the Martyr of St. Thomas, I visited there the orphanage house. It was so terrible, and I realized, oh, they are the wounds of Christ today. And the poverty and all this. There are so many wounds in human hearts, and social wounds, psychological wounds, and we should touch the wounds. If we ignore the wounds, we are not worthy to say, my Lord and my God, as the Apostle Thomas, just by touching the wounds. So I think it's very important not to ignore the wounds.
Hi, it was a wonderful talk. One thing I was wondering, this is maybe a comment or a question, I don't know where it's going, is that you said that we need to replace what the current populism is with institution of religion, or at least ideals of that. And one thing I've noticed is that populism is somewhat of a religion. I mean, it has the elements of it. You watch a Trump rally and he's kind of like a preacher to a crowd that's open to listen to him, at least open to him, not to a lot else. And also then in the 20th century, communism was somewhat of a religion. It was an ideology, and people believed Stalin was like a god, and he even believed he was a god in some ways. One thing I was wondering was, in our post-secular world, as you put it, there are some people that are apprehensive to the Catholic Church and its ideology and its religion. And what would you say to people like that? I mean, I personally see that some of the, even though I'm not religious, some of the ideals of it are good, but what would you say to people that really can't accept the religious aspect with the moral?
I'm not sure if I understood.
Maybe it was a little
well.
confusing.
Can we somehow package all the good in the Catholic Church, in other words, the kind of moral vision, but without the religion? Can we separate them somehow?
Can we have the Catholic values without the religion? Can we have a secular Catholicism?
Can we learn to love
Yeah.
our neighbor without accepting the one who told us to do that?
So it depends what we call religion. It depends. It could be defined in many ways. If it's concerned the institution or the ritual or the mysticism or the private spiritual life or the moral values, so it is very complex. It is very, 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 very complex. And if people say, I'm religious, I'm not religious. So there are so many levels of religiosity. The identification with the institution, there are my own spiritual life, there are the moral, and so on. So nobody is so equal strong in all these dimensions. Right? The dimensions of the religious life are very different among the people. So I'm very fascinated with the sentence of the master Eckhart. He said the inner man has an inner God, and the outward man has an outward God. So I think there are some people, they are living as on the surface, and those people have the image of God, which is really the projection of their own desires and fears. Then Freud and Marx are absolutely right about this type of religiosity of the people. They are on the surface. Only the people, when they have really the metanoia, when they discover something, the depths, dimension of their own life, they discover also the inner God, who is not only the projection of our fears and desires, who is really the partner of the ego of our ego, and so I think this mystical way is for me very important. But we need sort of culture, you know. For example, in our country, many my friends say I'm Buddhist, and I was in the Buddhist monastery in Japan, and I spoke long hours with the Japanese thinkers, Buddhist thinkers, and they say, you know, those people are the Christians. They would not to accept the Christian ethics, the church institution, and this reducing Christianity. They think it is Buddhism, and it is absolutely not Buddhism. It has nothing to do with Buddhism. It is just the reduced Christianity. So sometimes they are the secular version of Christianity. I think the secular humanism is the way, you know, during the religious wars in the 17th century, there were some intellectuals, European intellectuals. They were not able to agree or to identify themselves with Catholic or Protestant. They were looking for some third way of Christianity. And if they were not accepted by the churches, they were step by step more secular. And I think the Enlightenment and the secular humanism is the fruit of this deinstitutionalization of Christianity. It has still some Christian values, but sometimes I think we need also these things like the mysticism and all these other part of the religion. You know, sometimes I know, for example, the dangerous development in the sects. In the sects, they are the people, they are deeply religious. They don't want any structure, institutional structure. But it is sometimes very dangerous because some mad people could be the great gods. Such of people in the Catholic seminaries, they will be put out in the second year. But if in the sect they are nothing like the hierarchy, like the tradition, like the institution, it is also a little bit dangerous that it could be a milieu for a very crazy people. So sometimes the institution, the tradition, and all these things could play some important role. I don't want to ignore it so much.
You spoke a little bit about basically how TV had become religion, and that made me hi there. That made me think a little bit of the work of Walter Benjamin, and then you spoke later on about how how we've become desensitized to images of violence just because we're so saturated with them. And that made me think of the McLuhan theory of communication, mainly that our brains are changed by virtue of the technological mediums we're using to access information. And then you referenced the angry emails that you keep getting from people who are attacking you as a person with full of aggression and all of that. And I was wondering, when a lot of people answer the question, why do you like Donald Trump so much? A lot of them will answer, well, he says what he thinks. And I interpret that as saying, well, he says what I would only be willing to say on the internet under the protection of anonymity without human contact. I don't have to say it to your face. I can hide behind my screen. Yeah. And I wonder, you said about opening up spaces for debate, for conversation, and just, do you think there's an element of just sheer human contact that's necessary there just because of how internal we've become as a result of technology?
Absolutely. I love the sentence of Martin Heidegger that technology overbridged all distances but didn't create any nearness. Yeah? And I think it's very important. We overbridged the distances, but we didn't create a nearness. Nearness is not only the lack of distance, it's a special quality of human relations and the relations also with the nature and so on. So I think we need this culture of nearness. And it has much to do with this touching. Also touching the wounds, but also the contact. Because sometimes I'm looking of the little children, they are playing on the internet, and they have no patience with the living person, because if the grandmother is coming, they cannot just put the poor delete. And they have no patience with the normal conversation, because they are used just to pull.
I think we're running slightly out of time, but we have one last question.
Yeah. Thank you very much for a wonderful presentation. I was trying to weave together a number of things that you said and a question at the end. I was reminded of I was a member of an indigenous peoples delegation to the United Nations Human Rights Commission in Geneva. And I went there very idealistic about what the Human Rights Commission does, and then I saw the politics and the arguments and so forth. At one point, the Russian delegate made a statement in an attack against the United States, which I agree with. And then the US delegate said something about Russia that I also agree with, and they just kept talking past each other. And I thought that when you're talking about ideologies and conflict, and that we have to get beyond tolerance. I talk about acceptance, and it doesn't mean that you agree with the other person, but you accept that they are saying something that they feel very deeply and so forth. So it's not a clash of ideologies. And then your idea in communication, I'll connect that with your idea of touching the wounds of the other. So if we can accept that the other person has for them, a very valid way of seeing things, which might directly contradict my own. But I might be able to tease out by finding what we have in common. I've done this a number of times, and then without trying to force my view first, but rather see what they are saying, and it helps them clarify what they're said, and they might calm down a little bit, and then we can have a real communication going on. And I think it's important to accept in that way, and not, we're tempted often, this idea comes which opposes mine, and then I right away jump in with an idea or a counter ideology instead of trying to experience what that person is experiencing and respond to the pain that they're feeling, touch their wounds, and then they become more able to communicate, and maybe we can come to some kind of common agreement.
I think we need some space for the contemplation and listening and to work with this all emotions. I remember I met in India one Jesuit, and he said, when I came to India, my first impression was, oh, this is terrible, all the poverty, and so I will disappear. So it's the infantile, disappear. And then he was thinking further, and the second temptation was a revolution. There must be a revolution. And after, he was meditating more and more, and then he received the inner power to withstand. And he taught me, the people, they really changed the face of India, like Mother Teresa or Mahatma Gandhi. They were people of meditation, and they were able to withstand there and without violence. And it needs some time if you go a little bit deeper, and you can purify this short reaction. If we have so the enemies and all the evils and all the scandals, we have this short reactions not to see it or to beat it. But then we must a little bit to purify it, this first emotional reaction, to go deeper and deeper, and then discover the strength to be there, to withstand there, to work there step by step, without violence, with patience, and with the inner strength. And I think we need the people with this inner strength. So
that's a wonderful way of finishing. Thank you so much, Tomas. Thank you so much.